A century of beauty turned to bone. That is the price of peace in the Northern Territories. For 100 years, the High Lords offered their daughters to the obsidian altar of the Black Keep, hoping to break the curse of the slumbering Wolf King. They only succeeded in feeding the silence. By the winter of 1244, hope had rotted into a bitter tax paid in human lives. But that year, the ruthless alpha of the Ironwood Pack chose a different path. He did not send his pampered daughter. He sent a scapegoat. He sent a packless runt named Odette, intended to be nothing more than collateral damage for a sleeping monster. The pack thought they were discarding trash. They did not realize they were handing the true king his crown. The winter of 1244 was unforgiving. It buried the Ironwood estate under 6 feet of snow and a suffocating atmosphere of dread. The centennial tribute was due. In the great hall, Alpha Gideon Vane paced before a roaring hearth, his heavy fur cloak scraping the stone like a predator's breath. Ancient law was absolute. The alpha of the strongest ruling pack was required to deliver a royal maiden to the Ethelgard Keep. This was a blood tithe demanded by the dormant magic of the land to appease King Alaric of House Valerius. He was the Lycan monarch, a feral god of war locked in a cursed sleep for exactly 100 years. Legend claimed only the blood and breath of a royal wolf could wake him. But after a century of failed tributes, the ritual had devolved into a public execution. In the corner of the hall, Cecilia wept. The Alpha's daughter clutched her velvet gown, her voice thick with terror. She claimed the keep was a graveyard, and the king a monster who drank the blood of girls in his sleep. Gideon Vane did not comfort her. His eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak doors. He turned to his lead huntsman, a scarred brute named Kalin, and gave the order to bring the Omega up from the kitchens. Down in the stained underbelly of the keep, Odette was scrubbing iron cauldrons. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from the lye. She was an anomaly in a world of predators. Where others shifted beneath the full moon, reveling in their strength, Odette was completely packless. She had no wolf spirit and no family. She had been found wandering the borders 20 years ago as a toddler, marked only by a strange crescent scar on her collarbone. To the Ironwood Pack, she was a null. She was taken in only to serve as the lowest tier of slave. When Kalin's heavy boots echoed on the cobblestones, Odette did not look up. She worked until his massive hand wrapped around her dark hair, yanking her backward. The lead huntsman growled that the alpha required her service. For a packless null, there was nowhere to run. She was dragged into the grand hall and thrown before the roaring fire. The sudden warmth stung her frozen bare feet. Odette kept her eyes on the floor, a survival tactic learned over 2 decades of abuse. Cecilia stepped from the shadows to sneer at the girl covered in grease and dirt. She argued that the magic of the Black Keep would reject a slave instantly, and the maesters would know they had cheated the tribute. Gideon Vane stepped down to tower over Odette. He remained unmoved. He noted that Odette had lived under his roof for 20 years. She smelled of their pines and their fires. They would dress her in silk. They would drape her in the ironwood crest. They would hide the slave beneath the costume of a queen. When the iron gates of Ethelgard slam shut, her status as a packless runt will cease to matter. The ancient tribute will be paid. The curse will finally have its meat. Inside Odette's chest, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every child in the north knew the nursery rhymes. King Alaric waits in a bed of stone. He waits for a bride to chew to the bone. "You are sending me to die," Odette said. Her voice was steady. It was a raspy alto that sliced through the crackle of the hearth. She finally looked up. Her violet eyes, that unnatural hue that always made the pack recoil, locked onto Gideon's. "The treaty demands a noble daughter. I am not royal blood." Gideon did not argue. He roared. He struck her across the face with a backhanded blow. The force sent Odette sprawling. A fresh split opened across her cheekbone. "You owe this pack your life," Gideon spat. Now you will pay your debt. Dress her. The carriage leaves at midnight." They tore away her rags. They forced her into a heavy gown of midnight blue velvet. The fabric was stiff. It smelled of mothballs and old dust. At her throat, they pinned the silver direwolf of ironwood. Odette remained silent. In the brutal hierarchy of the lichen territories, a packless wolf had less value than a kennel hound. At midnight, Kaelin shoved her into a reinforced iron carriage. There was no ceremony. There were no banners. Only a huntsman, a weary driver, and a scapegoat heading into the dead lands. As the carriage lurched forward, Odette wiped the dried blood from her skin. She was going to die in a frozen, cursed tomb. Yet, as the ironwood estate vanished into the blizzard, a dark comfort took root. At least, she would die away from them. The trek across the wastes lasted 3 grueling weeks. The scenery died. Lush pines gave way to the jagged desolation of the wasting moor. Here, the magic of the curse felt like a physical weight in the air. The trees were petrified. Their black branches reached like skeletal fingers for a sunless sky. On the 21st day, Ethelgard finally appeared. It was a colossal fortress carved into the mountain's heart. Its spires pierced the grey clouds. It was not a palace, it was a sepulchre. Kaelin halted the horses at the drawbridge. Odette's breath caught as the massive iron doors groaned open. The bridge lowered on rusted chains over a black abyss. "This is as far as I go," Kaelin grunted. The scarred brute was trembling. His internal wolf was whimpering. It sensed the ancient apex predator sleeping within those walls. "Get out," he ordered. Odette stepped into the freezing wind. The velvet gown offered no protection against the supernatural chill. "Walk the bridge," Kaelin commanded. He kept his hand on his silver-hilted dagger. "If you run, I will put an arrow through your spine." Odette did not look back. She gathered her heavy skirts and stepped forward. The wooden planks groaned under her boots. Below, the chasm whispered. It sounded like 1,000 voices crying in the dark. Odette reached the massive iron doors of the keep, expecting them to be locked. She pressed her bare, freezing hand against the metal. A deep, resonating hum vibrated through the iron. These doors had not moved for 10 years. Now, they swung inward with the deafening screech of ancient hinges. Odette stepped over the threshold. Behind her, Kaelin whipped the horses. The carriage fled toward the safety of the south, as if pursued by demons. Odette was alone. The grand foyer of Ethelgard was a cavernous void of black marble. Perpetual frost coated every surface. Pillars rose into shadows, supporting a vaulted ceiling lost to the gloom. The hall was not empty. As Odette's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she gasped. Dozens of statues were scattered across the floor. She stepped toward one and felt her pulse hammer. It was a young woman in a decaying dress of emerald silk. Her face was a mask of absolute terror. Odette recognized the tarnished crest on her necklace. It belonged to the Runt pack. This was no statue. This was Lady Beatrice, the tribute from 30 years ago. Odette backed away, stumbling into another frozen figure. It was a man in ceremonial armor from the Westfold pack. The curse had not killed them. It had suspended them in time. They were living monuments of ice, forced to guard a sleeping king. The sheer magical power was unfathomable. A whisper drifted through the hollow wind. It said, "They failed." Odette wrapped her arms around herself. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She needed fire to survive this lethal cold. She wandered deeper into the keep. She passed dining halls where feasts had turned to dust. She saw armories where weapons had rusted to nothing. The air grew heavier, pulling her toward the heart of the fortress. She climbed a grand, sweeping staircase. Her legs burned with exhaustion. At the top stood double doors of solid silver. They were engraved with a wolf howling at a blood-red moon. This was the center of the curse. Odette pushed the silver doors open. The room was vast and circular. A massive oculus in the ceiling acted as a spotlight for the winter moon. In the center of that beam sat the throne of Ethelgard. It was constructed from swords, antlers, and jagged black obsidian. Odette's eyes locked on the figure sitting there. This was King Alaric of House Valerius. He was massive. He would stand 7 feet tall if he rose. He wore dark, rusted armor and heavy furs. Both appeared untouched by the passage of time. His head was bowed. His chin rested on a gauntleted hand. His eyes were closed in an unnatural sleep. Even in slumber, his power felt suffocating. He did not look like a civilized king. He looked like a feral god of war, bound by magic. His features were sharp and aristocratic, yet inherently savage. Long, thick black hair cascaded over his broad shoulders. A layer of frost covered his armor. Thick, thorny vines of black ivy grew from the floor. They wrapped around his legs and chest, anchoring him to the throne. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. Odette took a single hesitant step forward. Instinct told her to find a dark corner and freeze to death in silence. But something pulled her. A rhythmic thrumming in her chest began to match the king's slow heart. Thump. Thump. She climbed the dais. The air was so cold it burned her lungs like fire. As she reached the top, her boot snagged on a thick, thorny vine. She stumbled, catching herself against the obsidian throne. A jagged edge of black stone sliced deep into her palm. Odette hissed, jerking her hand back as the pain flared. A single drop of bright crimson blood fell. It landed on the frozen black ivy, binding the king's chest. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the blood sizzled. It sounded like water hitting a red-hot iron skillet. Where her blood touched the plant, it shriveled into white ash. Suddenly, the agonizingly slow beating of the king's heart accelerated. Odette scrambled back, clutching her wounded hand. Crack! The sound tore through the throne room like a gunshot. She froze. The frost on his dark armor was beginning to splinter. Spiderweb fractures raced across the ice on his broad chest. The distant thump, thump, suddenly became a roar. Thump, thump, thump. It vibrated through the stone and rattled her very bones. "No," she whispered. Panic flooded her veins. Gideon Vane had been wrong. The maesters had been wrong. The blood of a packless runt wasn't being ignored by the curse. It was doing something entirely different. The thorny vines that had anchored the king for a century began to writhe like dying vipers. They hissed and retreated into the floor as if terrified. The ice shattered, exploding outward in a shower of glittering diamond dust. Odette tripped over her velvet skirts, falling hard onto the stone. On the throne, King Alaric's fingers twitched. His metal gauntlet groaned. Slowly, the king lifted his head. Odette stopped breathing. His eyes snapped open. They were not human eyes. They were the glowing, molten gold of a predator. He drew his first breath in a century. It was a ragged, rattling inhale, like a hurricane through a canyon. He sat up, his massive frame dwarfing the obsidian throne. He didn't look disoriented. He looked furious. He looked starved. King Alaric rose to his feet. The heavy furs on his shoulders settled with a dull thud. He stood at his full, towering height. His shadow stretched across the circular room like a monster. He rolled his broad shoulders, and the ancient joints popped like dry wood. Then he stopped. His golden eyes locked onto Odette, cowering at the base of the dais. The king stepped down from his seat. One armored boot hit the stone, then another. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace. He was stalking her. Odette pushed herself backward, her hands scraping against the freezing stone. "Please," she stammered. Her voice failed her. Death felt inevitable. Every nursery rhyme from her childhood promised a slaughter. Alaric halted directly before her. At this distance, the king was a monument of violence. A jagged scar carved a path down his jaw. It vanished beneath the steel of his collar. This starving monarch did not see prey. His golden eyes narrowed. They were analytical, predatory. He reached for no blade. Instead, he leaned in. The scent hit Odette like a physical weight. Wet earth, sharp pine, the metallic tang of ozone and unrefined power. He pressed close to her throat. He inhaled deeply. Odette braced for the killing strike. She waited for teeth to find her jugular. But the sound that erupted from his chest wasn't rage. It was a low, vibrating purr. Territorial, possessive. It turned her blood to liquid fire. __quote_3___. His voice sounded like stones grinding in the dark. It was rough from centuries of silence, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. Odette shook her head in a panic. She stammered. Alaric moved. His calloused hands seized her jaw. He forced her gaze toward his burning eyes. His skin wasn't cold, it was searing. Packless. A dark, lethal smile tugged at his lips. It revealed the sharp edge of his canines. The southern usurpers have forgotten their own history. His voice dropped. The curse from Agatha of the Moor was absolute. Only the blood of a true sovereign breaks the stone. Odette stared, lost in the confusion. True sovereign? I have no wolf. I am a null. Alaric's thumb found the crescent scar on her collarbone, a mark she had carried since infancy, the very mark the Ironwood pack had mocked for years. You are no null, little bird. His voice softened, but the fire in his eyes intensified. Your wolf is not absent. She has been slumbering, exactly like me. He withdrew and offered a massive hand. They believed they were sending a sacrifice. His voice echoed through the hall. It carried the weight of a century of vengeance. Instead, they have returned my queen. Tell me your name, little bird. Odette, she whispered. She was too paralyzed to move. Odette. He tested the name on his tongue. His smile became something predatory. Thrilling. Rise, Odette, we have a kingdom to take back, and an alpha named Gideon Vane to slaughter. That certainty shattered 20 years of her reality. She stared at his hand. It was large enough to crush her skull, yet he offered it with ancient reverence. Shaking, she placed her small, blood-stained hand in his. His grip was unexpected, gentle. The heat of his skin burned through the ice in her marrow. As he pulled her to her feet, a violent tremor rocked the keep. A low groan started in the bedrock. It climbed through the black marble pillars. The sound of shattering ice filled the throne room. The curse is broken, Alaric rumbled. His eyes swept the chamber. The blood of House Crescentia has reclaimed the stone. Odette watched in silence. The thick frost on the walls began to weep. Rivulets of water carved paths through a century of dust, washing the rot from the ancient tapestries. Below, in the grand hall, the statues of the failed tributes stood frozen. They did not wake. As the curse withered, the magic holding their tragic forms together simply evaporated. A chorus of soft, heart-breaking sighs filled the air. Then, the ice collapsed. It turned into fine, glittering snow that drifted harmlessly over the cobblestones. The keep was finally granting them the peace of the grave. But against the far wall, the silence died. 3 massive figures encased in black ice began to convulse. The sound was like a cathedral of glass shattering in the dark. Shards exploded outward, striking the stone with a rhythmic clatter. 3 lichen warriors collapsed to their knees. Their armor was dark and rusted, the same ancient plate worn by their king. They gasped for air as if they had been drowning for 100 years. The largest of them, a brute with a face carved by scars and hair the color of iron, braced his fists against the wet floor. The slumber ends, Silas choked out. Alaric's voice carried across the vast space with the weight of a falling mountain. It ends, Silas. Rise. The usurpers have grown fat and arrogant in our absence. Silas staggered to his feet, his dark eyes locking onto Odette. He did not see a servant. He dropped his gaze instantly and slammed a heavy fist over his heart. My queen. Odette shrank back, her shoulders pressing into the jagged, cold edge of the obsidian throne. "I am not a queen," she stammered. Her voice climbed toward a frantic, hollow hysteria. She turned to Alaric, desperate for him to see the girl who lived in the dirt. "You are mistaken, my lord. I am Odette. I scrub the cauldrons. I sleep in the ash of the fire. I have no wolf. I cannot shift. Whatever blood you think you smell, it is a lie. Gideon Vane sent me here because I am worthless." Alaric stepped into her space. His massive frame eclipsed the pale light of the moon. He did not look angry. He looked fiercely, possessively certain. "Gideon Vane is a fool who cannot read the ancient texts," Alaric said. His voice was soft, but the gravel in his tone made the hair on Odette's arms stand up. Had he known the truth, he would have killed you in your crib. A century ago, the Vane bloodline allied with the witch Agatha. They ambushed my court. They slaughtered House Crescentia, the ruling monarchs of the northern wastes. They were the only bloodline powerful enough to keep my feral nature in check. They wiped them out, or so they thought, and then they locked me in stone. He reached out. His fingertips traced the pale, crescent-shaped mark on her collarbone. The touch sent a jolt of raw electricity through Odette's spine. A foreign, animalistic heat began to pool deep in her stomach. "This is not a scar from a blade, Odette," Alaric murmured. His golden eyes darkened to a molten, predatory amber. His scent of ozone and mountain pine wrapped around her like a heavy shroud. "This is the birthmark of the Crescentia matriarch. You do not feel your wolf because your environment was hostile. A Crescentia wolf does not submit to a lesser alpha. She goes dormant to survive. You have lived in a pack of traitors. You were surrounded by the scent of the dogs who murdered your ancestors. Your wolf locked herself away to keep you alive. She waited until you found me." Tears pricked Odette's eyes. A lifetime of beatings and shame, of being called a null, a runt, a waste of flesh, began to burn. Years of agonizing silence under a mocking moon had been the catalyst. Every failed shift, every night where the wolf refused to answer, felt like a celestial betrayal. Odette had lived as a cosmic error. But as she looked at the man before her, the question hung in the air. Was she truly the sovereign they had tried to break? Quote 20 quote, she whispered. A single tear traced a path down her bruised skin. Alaric caught the drop on his thumb before it could fall. Quote 21, he rumbled. Quote 22. He turned to his commander with the absolute authority of a monarch. Quote 23. At his command, Ethelgard exhaled. The three kings' guards, Silas, Cale, and the shadow-like Thorn, moved with a terrifying predator efficiency. They reclaimed ancient caches of salted meats and heavy winter cloaks, preserved for a century in cedar and silence. In a private antechamber, Odette shed the moth-eaten velvet that had been her cage. She scrubbed the grime of servitude and the copper tang of dried blood from her skin. The water, heated by Silas, felt like a baptism. When she faced the cracked silver mirror, the girl who cleaned floors was gone. She stood wrapped in woven black wool and dark fur, pinned by the silver crest of House Valerius. The scullery maid was dead. The warrior had arrived. The bruise on her cheek remained a grim testament to Gideon's cruelty. Yet the terror in her violet eyes had been replaced by a quiet, burning realization. She was House Crescentia. She was no one's slave. When she emerged, Alaric stood by the hearth in the grand hall. He had discarded his heavy plate, wearing only dark leathers and a linen shirt that strained against his massive, corded muscles. His gaze was a physical weight, tracing her from her boots to the dark braid on her shoulder. A low, subharmonic purr vibrated in his chest. It was a sound that commanded submission and promised absolute protection. "It is time to go home, little bird," Alaric said, draping a heavy fur over his shoulders. The wasting moor beckoned. They would show Gideon Vane the price of waking a god. As they descended from Ethelgard, the atmosphere of the world shifted. The suffocating magic that had petrified the land was breaking. The frozen black earth softened beneath their boots. The petrified trees ceased their agonizing wails, settling into a respectful silence. Odette rode a warhorse as dark as midnight, a beast Silas had coaxed from a century of magical stasis. Alaric walked beside her. His long strides easily matched the horse's heavy gait. He was a creature of immense stamina, an apex predator unfazed by the biting wind or the treacherous terrain. Yet Odette could feel the coiled tension within him. His golden eyes scanned the horizon with lethal precision. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of the bitter wind. He was starving. 100 years of sleep had depleted his lichen reserves. The beast was clawing at the surface, dangerous and hollow, demanding both violence and sustenance. "We are nearing the border of the Ironwood estate," Silas reported. He dropped back from his scout position. The wind carried a thick, unmistakable scent. It was the Ironwood pack. Gideon Vane's patrols had established a camp at the tree line. They were waiting. They wanted to be certain the tribute was dead. Alaric's jaw clenched. The faded scar on his cheek pulled taut. He turned to Odette. His eyes were cold and merciless. "They wait to ensure you are dead," he said. Odette's hands tightened on the leather reins. She remembered Kaelin's laughter as he locked the carriage. She remembered the weight of Gideon Vane's hand. A strange, unfamiliar heat began to bloom in her chest. It was not the emptiness she usually felt. It was a heartbeat, a second, deeper rhythm throbbing in tandem with her own. Traitor. The word echoed in her mind. It was a feral, instinctual thought. It came with a mental flash of bared teeth. Odette gasped. She pressed a hand to her temple. Alaric was at her side instantly. His hand rested on her thigh. The heat of his touch grounded her. "I felt something," she whispered. Her violet eyes were wide with shock. Anger. But it was not mine. It felt wild. A fierce, triumphant smile broke across Alaric's face. "She is waking up," he said. "Your wolf smells the blood of her enemies." He told her to feel it. He told her not to push it down. He turned toward the dark tree line of the Ironwood border. "Silas, keep her safe. Do not intervene unless she is threatened." Before Odette could ask for an explanation, Alaric walked forward. A horrifying, beautiful transformation took hold of him. It was not the painful, bone-breaking shift of modern wolves. It was fluid. It was shadow melting into shadow. His boots tore apart as massive, clawed paws hit the earth. His spine elongated. His muscles expanded, tearing through his linen shirt. Dark fur erupted across his skin. In seconds, the man was gone. A monster from the darkest legends of the North stood in his place. Alaric, in his lichen form, was a nightmare of muscle and midnight fur. He stood 9 feet tall on his hind legs. His eyes burned like twin suns in the gloom. He let out a roar. It shook the snow from the distant pines. It was a sound of pure dominance. It demanded that every living thing bow or perish. Odette's horse whinnied in terror. Silas held the bridle firm. Odette was trembling, but not from fear. The second heartbeat in her chest was hammering a frantic rhythm. Her vision swam. The world turned a sharp, hyper-focused silver. She could smell pine needles miles away. She could hear the racing of human hearts in the distant camp. Alaric dropped to all fours. He launched himself toward the trees. He moved faster than the eye could track. He was a blur of shadow and violence. In the Ironwood camp, Kaelin the huntsman was warming his hands. He laughed with 5 other border guards. He believed the Runt was already an icicle. He believed the Alpha's debt was paid. A younger guard asked if the magic would reject her. He knew she was not royal. Kaelin spat into the fire. "The stone does not care," he said. "Blood is blood." Then a massive shadow fell over the camp. It eclipsed the weak winter sun. The clearing did not just break, it detonated. Before Kaelin could even touch his hilt, the black lichen hit the center like a falling star. Frozen earth shattered. Men and burning timber were tossed into the freezing air like kindling. Panic took hold. The Ironwood guards shifted, their fur bristling as they became timber wolves. But against Alaric, they were nothing but pups. This was not a duel, it was an eradication. One swipe of his massive claw sent 2 wolves into the pines. Their spines snapped on impact. The sound echoed across the woods. He caught a 3rd wolf mid-air. The crunch of bone was the only sound in the sudden, terrifying silence. Kaelin saw his own death. He scrambled back toward the supply cart. He grabbed a heavy crossbow and slotted a silver-tipped bolt. He leveled the weapon at the black beast. But movement at the edge of the woods stopped his breath. Odette appeared on a black warhorse. She was not a corpse. She was a vision of House Crescentia. She sat, draped in royal furs, flanked by armored warriors of old. Her violet eyes burned with a luminescent intensity. Kaelin's hands shook. He knew he was a dead man. In a final, desperate act, he pivoted. He pointed the silver-loaded crossbow at Odette's chest and pulled the trigger. Silas roared a warning, lunging forward, but the distance was too great. Odette watched the silver streak toward her. Time slowed to a glacial crawl. The scullery maid within her wanted to scream. She wanted to cower in the dirt. But the ancient spirit beneath the ash finally snapped its chains. "Mine," the voice growled in her skull. It was not a plea. It was a sovereign command. Odette did not shift. "Not yet," she whispered. She threw her hand toward the incoming projectile. A flash of silver magic erupted from her palm. This was not a spell. It was the raw dominance of the Crescentia bloodline. The light met the bolt mid-air. The wooden shaft turned to dust instantly. The silver tip fell harmlessly into the snow 10 feet away. The world went silent. Alaric froze. His muzzle was stained crimson. His golden eyes locked onto Odette with feral pride. Kaelin dropped the empty crossbow and fell to his knees. He felt the suffocating aura rolling off her. It was a power that demanded total submission. It was a weight the North had not felt in a century. "The Crescent," Kaelin whispered. His voice was a cracked ruin. Gideon Vane had made a fatal error. He had not sacrificed a null. He had awakened a goddess and given her an equalizer. Alaric stalked toward the trembling huntsman. He looked back at Odette. The question in his eyes was silent. "His life belongs to you." Odette stared at the man who had dragged her by her hair. She remembered his promise to put an arrow in her spine. The mercy of a slave had been cauterized by the silver light. "Execute him," Odette said. Her voice was icy and calm. It was the authority of a true queen. Alaric's jaws snapped shut. As Kaelin's body hit the snow, the king shifted back. He stood naked in the biting cold, uncaring of the world. He wiped the copper-tasting blood from his chin and walked toward the horse. Alaric looked up at her. The feral madness in his eyes had settled into a quiet, terrifying devotion. "Welcome back, my queen," he whispered, pressing his blood-stained forehead against her knee. "Now, we take Ironwood." The journey south bore no resemblance to Odette's terrified flight to the north. The razor-sharp winds of 1244 did not bite them. They parted. The atmosphere bowed to the suffocating weight of the magic radiating from the Lycan monarch and the Crescentia queen. Rumors of the Black Keep's thaw raced ahead of them like a forest fire. As Alaric, Odette, and the 3 guards marched, their numbers began to swell. Gideon Vane had ruled through cruelty. Cruelty creates enemies, and those enemies were now waking up. Lord William Harrington of the River Run pack felt the shift in the wind. His own aunt, Beatrice, had been frozen as a tribute decades prior. He rode out with 50 of his elite warriors, expecting to slay a monster. Instead, Harrington found Kaelin's mangled remains. He found a king of legends standing beside a girl who glowed with the cold, silver light of the moon. Harrington immediately dropped to his knees in the snow. He bared his neck in absolute surrender. Behind him, 50 men did the same. The rebellion had transitioned from a hope to a reality. That night, they camped on the lip of the Ironwood borders. The air was thick with the smell of roasting venison and the electric charge of coming violence. Odette sat upon a fallen oak, her mind reeling. The second heartbeat in her chest was no longer a frantic flutter. It was a steady, powerful drum. It was demanding release. Alaric approached, his massive frame casting a protective shadow over her. He had donned a fresh tunic and a heavy leather gambeson, but he moved with the coiled energy of a beast on a short leash. He sat beside her, the heat radiating from his body soaked into her chilled bones. "She is restless," Alaric noted. His golden eyes watched the flames reflect in her violet gaze. "Your wolf knows her territory is near." "I am terrified of her," Odette confessed. Her voice was a mere ghost of a sound. For 20 years, she had been told she was a null, a scapegoat, a hollow vessel. She feared that if she let the wolf out, she would become a monster. She feared the rage would swallow her whole. Alaric reached out. His calloused fingers traced the line of her jaw, tilting her face toward his. His touch was an anchor. "You were never empty, Odette," he rumbled, his voice softening into a possessive purr. He revealed the truth Thorn had uncovered in the camps, the lie she used to scrub the cauldrons, the ash she slept in. Every inch of her life had been laced with wolfsbane and silver leaf. Gideon Vane hadn't just lied to her, he had systematically poisoned her for 2 decades. He had kept the Crescentia bloodline dormant through slow-motion torture. A cold shock washed over Odette. It was instantly replaced by a white-hot, blinding fury. This was not a defect of birth, it was a calculated theft of her soul. Alaric continued. He leaned in until his forehead rested against hers. The scent of ozone and sharp pine flooded her senses, soothing the beast within. Quote 45, quote 46. The mate bond didn't just pull, it snapped. It was an ancient predatory recognition, 2 souls fusing into a single weapon. This was not mere attraction. It was a merging of essences, a meeting of equals. Odette closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. She drew strength from his absolute certainty. "Tomorrow," she whispered. Raw silver magic sparked at her fingertips. "Tomorrow, I take my home back." Alaric's kiss was a fleeting, burning promise. It tasted of devotion and impending slaughter. "Tomorrow," he vowed, "we paint Ironwood red." Inside the great hall of Ironwood, the air was thick with the stench of cheap wine and stolen victory. Alpha Gideon Vane sat his throne like a king of ruins. His massive goblet sloshed with spiced wine as he laughed. But his eyes were restless. They darted toward the high, frosted windows. The winter outside was a starving beast, howling against the stone. Yet, the Black Keep remained silent. He believed he had won. He had survived the centennial tribute and successfully cheated a god. In the center of the room, his daughter Cecilia spun in circles. She was draped in imported silks, a cruel contrast to the rough wool the rest of the pack wore to survive the freeze. "Drink, you wretches!" Gideon roared to the assembled lords. Their cheers were weak and obligatory. "To the packless Runt," he sneered, "may her worthless bones keep the slumbering king occupied for another century. We are finally free of the tithe." The hall erupted in the sound of cowards laughing. Then the world broke. The sound was a concussive hammer of raw atmospheric pressure. The iron-reinforced oak doors, built to survive a siege, simply disintegrated. They didn't just open, they exploded off their hinges. Thousands of jagged splinters rained down on the screaming court like lethal hail. The laughter died instantly. The hearth fires hissed and flared, turning a violent, ghostly shade of silver blue. Through the swirling vortex of snow and dust walked 3 giants in rusted ancient plate. Silas, Cale, and Thorn stepped over the ruined threshold. Their broadswords hummed with a runic magic unseen in the Northern Territories for 100 years. Behind them, Lord Harrington and 50 River-Run warriors flooded the room. They moved like shadows, seamlessly blocking every exit. But it was the figures commanding the breach that stopped Gideon's heart. His goblet hit the stone. Ruby wine spread across the floor like fresh arterial spray. King Alaric Valerius stepped into the flickering light. This was no sleeping myth from a nursery rhyme. This was the feral god of war made flesh. His golden eyes burned with a century of suppressed, agonizing rage. His lichen aura was a physical weight. It crushed the lungs of the ironwood wolves. They collapsed to their knees, clawing at their throats, gasping for air that felt like lead. The room smelled of ozone, snapping pine, and the arrival of death. Yet, to the utter shock of the pack, the ancient king did not march for the throne. He stopped. He bowed his head in a gesture of profound submission. Then he stepped aside. From the shadows of the storm, Odette emerged. The air in the hall turned to ice as a single collective gasp broke the silence. The scullery maid was dead. Gone was the girl covered in ash and bruises, the runt they had cast into the dark to die. Now she stood draped in the midnight furs of Alaric. Silver threads caught the light across her chest. But the fabric was a distraction. A terrifying, celestial aura radiated from her skin. The crescentia scar on her collarbone, the mark they once called a curse, now pulsed like a captured star. It wasn't a deformity, it was a crown of light. Cecilia stumbled, her expensive silks tangling around her legs. She screamed that it was a trick, a desperate lie. To her, Odette was still the null. "I am Odette of House Crescentia." Her voice was a dual-layered weapon. It held the ice of a woman and the ancient snarl of a god. The sound vibrated in the very marrow of every wolf present. She had returned to collect a blood debt. Gideon's face turned the color of ash. Logic died, replaced by raw panic. He reached into his furs and pulled out an amulet of jagged bone. This was the stolen relic of Agatha the witch. For 20 years, this tool had suppressed Odette's very soul. __quote _55____. Gideon shrieked, his voice cracking like dry wood. He ordered his guards to kill the runt. 12 ironwood warriors lunged forward, steel bared and screaming. Alaric didn't touch his blade. A low, bone-cracking roar signaled his transformation. He was ready to paint the floor in their blood. But Odette stepped forward. She raised a single glowing hand. "Mine," her wolf whispered in the silence of her mind. Odette did not endure the agonizing break of lesser wolves. She simply became. In a flash of blinding silver, the woman vanished. A towering white direwolf now stood upon the stone. Her fur shimmered like spun moonlight. Her violet eyes burned with a magic that defied explanation. This was the ancient matriarch of the sovereign bloodlines. When her paws struck the floor, the world shook. A silver shockwave hammered into the guards. They were thrown back like dolls, their swords clattering into the oak tables. Odette moved with a speed that blurred the senses. She cleared the distance to the dais in a single bound. Gideon held the bone amulet high, screaming a useless incantation, but the dark magic of the witch meant nothing to a true sovereign. The silver light from Odette's jaws hit the relic. It turned red, then white, and dissolved into ash in Gideon's hand. He began to scream, but the sound was buried. Odette tackled the false alpha. She pinned him to his own stolen throne, the weight of a god crushing the air from his chest. Ivory fangs rested millimeters from his pulse, the heat of her breath a suffocating reminder of his mortality. In that moment, the hierarchy of the Ironwood pack shattered. Every guard, every high-born lord, and every servant abandoned their pride. They dropped to the frigid stone as their internal wolves whined in primal terror. It was not a choice, it was an instinctual surrender to the true queen. Alaric moved through the sea of cowering bodies like a god walking through a graveyard. He did not spare a glance for the sobbing Cecilia. His gaze, burning with a golden predatory light, was fixed on the massive white wolf. There was no kingly distance in his eyes, only raw, feral adoration. Odette looked down at Gideon Vane. This was the man who had ordered her skin broken for the crime of a shattered plate. He had fed her wolfsbane and ash, hiding poison in her soap and her food. He had cast her out to die in the lethal, freezing dark. Her jaw tightened with a pressure that could end him instantly. She could snap his neck with less effort than it took to breathe. But Odette understood a truth Gideon Vane never would. A true sovereign does not need a corpse to prove their power. She was a queen, and death was too honorable an end for a coward. Odette shifted. The blinding white radiance of the transformation receded. Where the beast had stood, the woman remained. She landed with the silent grace of a hunter, the royal furs draped over her shoulders as if forged for her frame. She looked down at the pathetic creature, clutching a scorched hand to his chest. "You are broken, Gideon Vane," Odette declared. Her voice was a cold bell tolling in the silence of the hall. By her word, his titles vanished, his lands were forfeit. But the true strike was deeper. She reached into his very soul and snuffed out his alpha spark. Gideon Vane gasped, his eyes widening in horror as he felt the agonizing severing of his power. His dominant magic, once wielded like a weapon, was extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. He was now a null. "You will live out your days in the grease and the soot you once forced upon me," Odette continued. Her violet eyes held no pity. "You will scrub the iron until your fingers bleed. You will sleep in the ashes of the hearths you once commanded, and Cecilia will walk that path beside you." "Mercy!" Cecilia sobbed from the floor, crawling toward the dais. "Please, Odette, we are family. I am your sister in the eyes of the pack." Odette did not even look at her. "I am giving you mercy. I am allowing you to draw breath in my kingdom." She turned her back on their ruin and faced her kneeling people. Lord Harrington and the River-Run warriors remained bowed, their loyalty absolute. Alaric ascended the dais. He reached out, interlacing his large, calloused fingers with hers. The golden fire in his eyes met the violet magic in hers. This was an ancient bond, sealing itself in front of the world. He raised their joined hands high. "The wasting moon is dead," Alaric's voice boomed, vibrating through the very foundations of the keep. "The slumbering king is awake. The Crescentia moon has risen. Ironwood belongs to the crown once more." The roar of approval that erupted from the liberated pack was a physical force. It shook the remaining glass from the high windows. Odette squeezed Alaric's hand as the suffocating weight of her past finally dissolved. She was no longer the packless runt. She was no longer a null. She was a survivor. She was the mate. She was the queen. A new era, forged in her ascension, had just begun. The grim winter of 1244. It was once prophesied for tragedy. Instead, it became the blazing dawn of a golden era. King Alaric and Queen Odette reigned. Their rule defied the false alpha's cruelty. It was a reign of fierce, protective justice, a justice echoing the ancient lichens themselves. The black keep of Ethelgard now stood abandoned, a silent monument to a brutal, vanished past. Meanwhile, the royal court thrived. It pulsed with life within Ironwood's reclaimed heart. Gideon and Cecilia were cast into obscurity. Their cruelties were repaid. They toiled, forced to endure the exact labor, the same burdens they had once inflicted upon the innocent. Odette, the packless runt, once abandoned to perish, she now taught the Northern Territories a profound lesson. True power, she revealed, was not a blood tithe, it was the unbreakable spirit, the spirit of a wolf refusing to remain dormant. The ancient curse was shattered, not by the blood sacrifice of a royal maiden, but by the awakening of a true